I'm going to try and run this, as the father said. I was at the Naval War College, and we used to, how they do that is they break the college students up into seminars. You have the same seminar for your whole term, but we do these historical studies, and there would be lectures, but when they went in for the seminar meetings, me and my teaching partner, I always had a PhD by my side to fact check me, but we'd get into discussion. So a lot of this is just meant to evoke discussion. That being said, how many of you guys, any veterans, military veterans in here? So quite a few. And I already talked to one of them. Anybody else here attend either the Naval War College or the Army War College or Air Force War College? We do have one, Doug over here. We were just chatting before I got going. But I really don't want to talk about there will be, of course, some talk about what happened at the grassroots, fighting level, but really kind of in tune with what the War College does is kind of get into a strategic discussion about aspects of the war and decisions that led to these battles and some of the strategic thinking that led to the outcomes. So, without going on too long, my biggest concern, because I used to do these seminars in Newport at the War College, and later, after I retired from active duty, taught them online, but we always had plenty of time, so my biggest concern going in today, what I'm trying to get accomplished today, used to take 3.5 hours at the War College. We'd have all morning of seminar day and do it. I'm going to try and get it down to as close to an hour as I can. When I did it at home, it was like 70 minutes, but that kind of depends. Back in those days too, I had to drag out of my students' commentary from 16 or 17, 18 guys, or there were a few women that came through at that point, and that kind of lengthened everything. But don't let me, I'm not going to waste any more time with this background stuff. So, here's our objectives. I need to kind of get everybody talking the same language, so I'm going to discuss some of the foundational theories on war and define some terms, and then we'll start getting into this program here. Talk about Japanese and American strategic policy objectives in the 1940s. Analyze the decisions that they made based on that for Battle at Midway and Guadalcanal, and at the end, assess the reasons. I'm going to argue that Japan made some major screw-ups in the decisions for war, for these battles. And conversely, the Americans, probably a pretty good decision for Midway, but Guadalcanal, who knows? We could argue that one out. So, I'm going to start with a little bit of background on classic strategic thought. And I got a picture of Karl von Clausewitz up here. Guy died about 100 years ago. But he was in the process, and he had a first draft done of a book he called On War. And even though it's a long time ago, and the tactics and fighting methods that existed then no longer do, this guy is still the go-to expert and is still read at the highest levels of our strategic schools. He's an interesting character. By the time he was 12 years old, he was an officer in the Prussian army. And the Prussian army fought a lot. And so I can't imagine this, Hessians and Prussians, they're big people. I can't imagine a 12-year-old kid out there going, you attack over there, flank them. But, he was out there doing that, but he made a career of it. He was actually a general at Waterloo. And he had Wellington's flank at the battle. He wrote his book in the 1820s. He died while it was still just a first draft. Now the book is this big, and there's a million takeaways from it. But the one for our discussion here today, I just want you to focus on, is this one. His famous quote, "War is a continuation of political activity by other means. And the political object is the goal." And from that you can deduce, and he says this in a million different ways in the book, operational strategies should necessarily be arrived at based on the degree to which they support the political objective. So the strategy that the military adopts needs to support the policy objectives. It brings to mind a thing. I remember driving around in like 2004 or 5, and I'm driving down the road, and I see this gal go by me, and she's got a bumper sticker on it that says, "Stop this senseless war." You know, that's when we were in Iraq. And I just shook my head, you know. What an inane thing to say. There's no senseless wars. Every war is fought for a reason. You might not like the reason, but the fact is there is a reason. So saying this is a senseless war is kind of obtuse. There's no absolute wars. People just don't fight for the purpose of fighting. They fight for political reasons. So let's get some definitions too. Strategic level discussion, and the strategic level that I'm going to talk about defines when, or how, and what the political objectives or policies are. Political objectives are always based, at least the most important ones that you would fight over, vital national interests. Vital national interests, I always equate that to something you will fight over. This is something you will go to war over. Strategic level, who makes up, where does these policies that the strategic level comes up with, anybody have any ideas, where does this come from? Who sets these policies? Does Congress vote on it? President by himself?
National Security Council to help?
Yeah, the president, it's the president. He said the National Security Council he's going to bring in. He's going to bring in anybody he wants. He's going to bring in people from all kinds of things. He's going to bring in political leaders, business leaders, industry leaders. Who knows? He could draw from anything he wants. Get into think tanks, come up with positions, and the president decides that's what we're going to do. Is there any room for a military guy in that scenario?
Should be.
What's the military guy's role going to be?
He's going to be able to see what is possible or not possible.
Perfect answer.
And what the cost will be.
Exactly. Because he could say to him, yep, we can do that, but this is what it's going to cost you. Then the political leader can assess whether or not he wants to pay that price. How vital is it? Is the cost worth the gain? So he's got minimal, he's got minimal input. I mean, he might just frankly say, well, that all sounds pretty good, Mr. President, but we don't have a military structure that's going to be able to support those objectives, so let's back off a little bit. At the next level, operational level, now you're talking about maybe even fleet commanders, or the guys out there who are going to develop strategies to support the national policy. A lot of their planning is just when, where, how we're going to do this. Now, what level of political involvement you want with that? I mean, Commander-in-Chief is the president. How much input does should a politician get in coming up with those high-level military operational decisions? Anybody got any ideas?
Probably minimal.
As much as they want, probably, right?
Probably minimal. Sometimes, like I'll give you an example. At the beginning of the Civil War, Lincoln calls in, I think it was General Scott, and says, what should we do? And Scott outlines this great anaconda strategy you might have read about if you studied anything on the Civil War. It was probably a pretty good strategy. Probably would have worked over a long period of time. But the politician, Lincoln, says, that ain't gonna work. I'm not gonna be able to keep the people on board with this for 6, 7 years while you eventually strangle this movement. So the political decision is like, now you got to do something quicker. But he's not going to, now you're getting into the tactical levels. He's not going to be involved in that stuff at all. Shouldn't be, at least. We see in World War II in Europe, Hitler does quite often get involved in some of those decisions. And if you've ever studied stuff, especially on the Eastern Front that happened, how'd that work out for him? Not too good. Not too good. Tactical level, that's a direct command of the trigger puller. So like Guadalcanal was General Vandergrift, And at the lower tactical levels, now you're talking about the guys that are really putting, the guys in the field and doing all the kind of tactical application. Real-time combat leadership. Again, what is national policy? How's it arrived at? We kind of hit on it already. It's vital national interests, things you will fight over. And some examples, back in the 19th century, America, first and foremost, to think about it as far as Americans and what our policy is based on. What do you think of Americans? What are we first and foremost in the world?
Freedom.
But what is our, I don't know, maybe it's a kind of an obtuse question, but I say above all things, Americans in the world are business people. And we're really good at it. We're really good at making money. We're really good at making deals and partnerships and that kind of stuff. And that's really kind of what everything has always been about, is getting out there and making deals and getting trade going. And we've done so well compared to everybody else that it's kind of inarguable, really. So our policy back in the 19th century, this open door policy, is really to do what? Anybody know your history on that?
Trade.
Trade with who?
With everybody else. China.
China was the specific one because all the European powers are rushing in there and carving it up. And America goes in and says, no, we're getting in here too, and we're always going to be able to get in here, and nobody's going to dominate this thing. We're going to be in there, and that's a vital national interest. So that meant if anybody said, screw you, we would have been willing to go to war over that.
When was that? Roughly?
Probably the 1840s. Remember, they built the clipper ships. They built a class of ships just to get there faster.
It's China.
The trade was so lucrative with China. So, yeah, that's always been kind of the governing principle here. So, some other examples, you got the containment policy. I think it was 1946 or 7. The Soviet Union was trying to move into Greece and Turkey. And Truman grabs up his cadre of his think tank people and comes up with this position like, he said, we are going to oppose any outside force that wants to go into Greece or Turkey. And he went on to say, anybody else that's going to disrupt, or anywhere else, I should say, that they want to go expand by use of force or subversion or whatever, we will oppose that. Is this containment policy? Can you think of any conflicts it might have led to? Vietnam? Korea. There's two right there. There's the big two. So nobody argued much with Truman in the 1940s when he said, we got to stop the spread of communism. It was quite clear what Soviet Union was up to, and it was a quite coherent and policy that pretty much the nation supported. And internationally, everybody was like, thank God, because we don't have the capability of doing that. But by the 1960s, the lessons of the 40s and the Soviet expansionism has been lost, and they're kind of subversive in doing it. But, it was inarguable. It was national policy that had been accepted for decades that led us to Vietnam. Unfortunately, the execution probably didn't match the wisdom of the policy. And again, Carter Doctrine, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Carter comes out and says, hey, anybody that's going to disrupt this region, particularly the Persian Gulf, that's a vital national interest, and we will do what it takes to maintain the stability there. Anybody think of any war? And he said, not just the Soviet Union, anybody that wants to do it. So anybody think of any conflicts that led to? Yeah, all these conflicts we've had with Iraq, because, all right, it's not the Soviet Union, but the view is Saddam Hussein in Iraq represents an unbalancing situation. And United States policy is based on, we want to be businessmen. We want global stability. We don't want bad guys or uncertainty in a region that has such strategic implications as the energy center of the world. We don't want bad guys running that. So we're going to do whatever it takes to stabilize it. We'll be the policemen, and everybody complains about that, but we're the best businessmen in the world. So that's always enriched us more than it's ever cost us. So let's get into World War II a little bit. Japan, they always had this military kind of samurai or code of Bushido type of leadership historically in their nation. It led them into war in the early 20th century against Russia, where they tried to expand into Manchuria. They won the war, sort of, but they didn't get much out of it. And the Japanese people made this enormous sacrifice for this war, and in the aftermath, they didn't feel like it was worth it. So they kind of pushed out the military leadership, and they actually had democratic governance through the teens into the 20s. And their biggest trading partner was America. Almost 100% of their trade was with America. When the Depression hits, the first protectionism measures that America does really kills the Japanese economy. They go from pretty good, vibrant economy to devastation. And so the critics of the Japanese trade policy with the outside world came forward again, which was these old-fashioned militarist Bushido people, quite racist, who just want to be an insular Japanese empire. And they kind of convinced the people, hey, this policy, trading with the gaijin and all these outsider foreigners, look what it's done for us. So what we need to do is get our own thing, that we don't have to worry about Americans for oil or steel or anything. We just got to do our own thing. We're going to take whatever it takes to do it, this area here, because within it, we've got all the resources we need. We don't need to trade with anybody outside this. We'll have our own empire, and the hell with everybody else. They got oil resources in the Dutch East Indies, and just astounding resources. They need nothing more than what they got there. So this policy now, the policy is going to be expansionism. And this is the policy objective area. One of the most important things you got to do, if you're going to do that, what kind of military force do you want?
You got to have a navy.
Going to have a big navy. But the bigger point is you're going to have to tailor your military forces to support this, what you want to try and accomplish. If you want to project power to here, you'd build a different type of force. If you want to just capture this, then you could probably do that fairly quickly, but now you're going to have to defend it. They wanted to go into China, so you need a pretty good land army, pretty good sized land army, but ultimately, Japan's an island nation. So they're a maritime nation. So they're really going to have to emphasize naval power, because, God knows they're going to do whatever it takes to keep the home islands from getting invaded. And that permeates their strategic thinking at all levels, government and high-level officers.
Paul, is there a history of Japan being invaded by foreign power? That's why they feel that way, or is it just...
Not that I know of. Yeah, they've always been pretty good about defending the...
So I'm wondering, why would they have that sort of mindset of wanting to protect the islands all the time?
Well, they studied, when they emerged into the modern world after they got opened up, they were biggest students of Great Britain. And as we know, Great Britain, their emphasis was always on the Royal Navy to protect us from invasion by the French or the Spanish. That really started with the Armada. And so, like Trafalgar, the culminating battle of the wars with the Napoleonic navies, this enormous victory, they annihilate the French fleet. It made them, that really made them completely defended from any invasion. Now they had the freedom to use their navy to project power all over the place. Importantly, the Japanese have neither, that's the line, that's the red line in the sand kind of, they had neither the intent nor the capability of ever invading the United States. It was never going to be on their radar scope like, okay, let's keep progressing so that eventually we can run up the beaches in California. They didn't have that capability. They were stretched pretty thin just trying to do this. So you have to remember, these are wars of choices. These are not imperatives like we have to defend this or we have to defend that because they're going to get California or something. That wasn't going to happen. The worst kept secret in U.S. strategy was moving through their attack based on War Plan Orange was to take their United States Navy and blast through the Central Pacific. And the Japanese built a Navy specifically designed to stop that from being successful. And let me get into that in some other slides. They postponed the attack through the Central Pacific by attacking the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. But a quick discussion, how did that work out for them? Resounding victory? Remember, in this area here, what was Japan's biggest concern, would you guess, in this East Asia co-prosperity sphere? Their energy resources are going to be down here. They've got resources over here. What's right in the middle of it in 1940, 41 that's a big problem? The Philippines. Who owns the Philippines? It had been a territory of the United States. There's a huge military American presence there, and they don't want Americans in the middle of their empire. So that's really the gold nugget here that they're after. They come up with this idea to go outside their policy objective area and attack Pearl Harbor and destroy the American fleet. But what did they really accomplish with that? Anybody know how old, the quality of the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor? The battleships that they sank there? The newest one was built in 1915, USS California. The Navy was run by battleship officers, because that's the career pipeline to become an admiral, surface warfare, battleships, and they had these aircraft carriers, but their role was really kind of nebulous. These battleship surface warfare guys really didn't know how to incorporate aviation into what they were trying to do, what they should be doing. The Japanese were light years ahead of us in that because they were figuring out how to use it to project power. But the force was really tailored to do this. They have all these islands they're going to fortify. They had plenty of aviation. The original plan called for them to have landing strips all through these islands for land-based air and these big ocean gaps. They had 10 aircraft carriers that were going to fill the gaps, plus big surface combatants. So here comes the fleet, the United States fleet into the Central Pacific. What were they sailing into? So that kind of goes to a question I was going to ask eventually. Maybe I won't. So anyway, they attack Pearl Harbor, go outside their objective area. Probably the gains they made were not worth it, because if the Philippines is the objective over here, why not attack there? What do you think the response of the American people would have been if Japan attacked the Philippines?
Not much.
Does Joe Sixpack in Chicago care that Manila just fell to the Japanese? Can President Roosevelt come up with this rousing speech about, oh my God, they attacked the Philippines? This is, the average guy doesn't understand vital national interests and trade policy and stuff. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt, you got to, if you think about this afterwards, go look up on YouTube or online Roosevelt's speech in light of how he's trying to get the people to really support this thing. Because, it was mostly our parents that were going through this. I remember asking my mother and father, what did you think when you tuned in on the radio? What were you thinking before he spoke? And they said, well, we didn't know what we should do. We didn't know what was going on. Japan, most people are Eurocentric, they're European people, and that's the way they look at the world. So they didn't know what we should do. And then Roosevelt just lights them up. And the next thing you know, the American people go from that attitude to young men lined up around the block to join the Marine Corps overnight. And so probably more than anything, the Japanese just screwed this up big time. they had attacked the Philippines, they probably would have got away with it. We probably would have declared war. Probably would have been a 50-50 vote in Congress and lots of acrimony on both sides. And then we sail the Central Pacific with our 25-year-old battleships and get our asses kicked. And everybody goes, well, now what are we going to do? Is it worth it? Anyway, sometimes I get ahead of my slides in these discussions. Well, let's just stick with this. We'll stick with the scenario a little better. By April 42, they have achieved all their pre-war objectives. So now what do they do? Why? Now what should they do? It's public knowledge in a strategic picture of things. It's public knowledge to everybody in the world that our priority is Germany. Our priority was Germany, and it was kind of a win in Europe, hold in the Pacific, and then win in the Pacific. They knew that the attack was probably going to come through the Central Pacific, but that was some time away because they had postponed our attack by sinking the battleships. Now, there's a couple of strategic or operational strategic things that come into play here. They've got enormous momentum. Clausewitz would say, that's the policy or the theory of continuity. You've got momentum, keep going. But on the other hand, he also talked about there being culminating points of attack or culminating points of victory where you've gone far enough. If you go any further, you can't defend it. So let me ask you guys, what should the Japanese do now? What's that? Fortify? Execute their policy, their strategy policy match, right? They've got what they were after. They got the force designed to defend it, and it's pretty nasty. And anybody got any other thoughts on it?
Try to make some kind of a treaty with the Americans and to keep it a peaceful relationship.
That would be perfect. They probably need another victory or something, but yeah, as soon as they can, settle this thing. We got what we want. Let's be nice. We always had good relations with the Americans and traded with them enormously. So let's just try and get it back where it was. But America throws them a curveball.
Hey, pose a question then.
Yeah.
Well, the question I have is, whose idea was it in the Japanese Empire? Was it the emperor or was it the military that wanted to do the attacking and taking over?
It's kind of vague on history. He was asking for the recording purposes, whose idea was it to establish this policy in Japan? I'd say the emperor had to be heavily involved. It really emerged when the militarists took over after, they swept aside the democratic governance and come in, and I think it had to be very collaborative between all of those guys you mentioned, emperor, military leaders, and so they decided to do it. Do you think they ever really had a chance? Could this ever have worked?
I just read Victor Davis Hansen's book, The Second World Wars, and he makes the case in that book that the American economy at the beginning of the war was 10 times the size of the Japanese economy. And we were in the middle of the Depression, and we had 20% of the people out of work. And when they did that, they did it, I think, and he thinks to some degree, with the idea that this is going to have to be short and sweet. Yamamoto said, I can rule the Pacific from December 7th, 1941 until for 6 months. And curiously enough, you can talk about Midway, which is about exactly 6 months later.
Right.
And he said, now I have a question for you, i.e. his bosses. If we don't win this convincingly immediately, we will have awakened, quote, a sleeping giant.
Sure, everybody's heard the quote, but
Yeah,
and there's no doubt, there's no question, and I'll have it at the end if if we're not going too long, some discussion of war production. And yeah, clearly we're going to be able to crush them with industrial production and even numbers of soldiers and sailors and stuff. But again, the people have to fight the war. So going back to our big map, if we have these strategies that support, that's going to drive right into the teeth of a very ferocious Japanese defense in the Central Pacific, and we get a fleet sunk and 15,000, 20,000 sailors sunk, if the people don't have the motivation to support the losses and so forth, it doesn't matter how big your economy is. You still have to manage it right. So, yeah, to me, that's the difference between an academic like this Hansen and a military guy, because you still got to get the people to buy into it, no matter how big you are. So, but nice point, thank you. So anyway, we throw them a curve. While they've already got kind of a little expansionist type of mindset going, and we'll talk about that in just a few seconds, but we throw them a curveball. Doolittle raid goes down in April of 1942. Really surprised the Japanese. Big curveball. They've been having things their own way for a long time. And this is one of those examples where a political leader, the president, gets a little bit involved in an operational decision. He pushed the military leaders to come up with something, kind of anything, to push back, to fight back. And they come up with, it's really kind of a cockamamie plan when you think about it. 16 B-25s take off of the Hornet and attack, and they're light loaded. They only had a couple of bombs because they were Scotia on gas. So they drop a couple of bombs and try and fly through to China, and that was it. They really didn't do any damage. In the big scheme of things, it was like a pimple on an elephant's butt. It didn't have any military impact whatsoever. But people that have studied this, what does it do to the Japanese leadership? What happens to the military leadership guys?
Well, they're in trouble because they said we were invincible and they never get home.
Yeah. So a lot of the subsequent discussion now about the Japanese and their decision making is a big critique of their culture, their values, their social arrangements and political systems. Because that stuff, which is really revealed to be not, it's a cultural inability to adapt to war in the 20th century. They don't know how to fight modern war. And their culture's gonna influence them to make some truly bad decisions. And this is the beginning of it right now. The Japanese Navy is humiliated. They promised the emperor and the people they'll never hit us, and they've lost face. And you know what that means in Japanese culture. Usually it's the old harry-carry now, because you disgraced yourself. So they don't commit harry-carry, but they're adamant they're going to take care of this, and they vowed they're going to end all threats to the home island. And what do they view as the main threats to the home island? American aircraft carriers. That's where the strikes came from. That's the big threat. So we need to come up with a plan to destroy the American aircraft carrier. And Admiral Yamamoto, their fleet commander, had one. He tried to implement this earlier in the war to attack Midway Island out in the middle of the Pacific, draw out and sink the Navy aircraft carriers. And so initially it was rejected by higher headquarters, but now they're reviving this idea. Let's attack Midway, draw the American carriers out so that we can beat them up and sink them. Really cultural and aptitude. Can you imagine you come up with a strategic policy area that you're going to conquer, you tailor your forces to it, but now you're going to violate all that because you're embarrassed. What a basis for a rational strategy decision. Japanese strategic objectives, 1942. Before, even though they did the raid on the Doolittle raid in April, there was already in planning a little bit of an expansionist move to the south, outside what would be outside the political objective area they originally designed. into southern New Guinea. They wanted to grab Port Moresby. Port Moresby, probably they wanted to control all this ocean area around here, and it leads to the Battle of the Coral Sea. This battle kind of reveals one of the problems in their strategic thinking. The admiral in charge down here for the Japanese, they fight it out. In the battle, the Japanese sink USS Lexington, one of our main fleet carriers. They severely damage USS Yorktown. They report it sunk, so as far as they're concerned, they sink 2 aircraft carriers. They lose a small aircraft carrier, but they withdraw. It's kind of incongruous. Like, they won. Tactically, they won the battle. They're all cleared to go in now and grab Port Moresby, but instead, they withdraw. My theory is these admirals that are running this have been brought up within a Navy culture and system where protection of the homeland is absolutely the most important thing. And the Navy is the most important asset we have to protect the homeland. So losing ships in battles of choice down here outside our objective area, they get a little tentative. That's scary. I lost ships down here, and later, we could have a real threat because we don't have the assets to protect the homeland. So my argument would be, if they were fighting in here and they lost a ship, they wouldn't care. They'd go on slugging it out in the defense of the homeland. But when they start to project power outside and they take a little bit of a hit, they pull back. That's not really a good warfighting position to be in. And it hurts them at Coral Sea. These are battles of choice, not necessity. So you're going to fight them a little bit different. So, all right, we kind of backed off from that, but let's go back to the question. Now what should we do? Anybody disagree with the earlier point? Play defense now. It's middle of 1942, and we've got everything we wanted to. We should be building this stuff up. We know the threat's coming. We need to get ready for this. But that's not the decision they make. Their Doolittle raid has freaked them out so much that they're willing to take this huge risk and go after Midway. But of course, as many of you know, Joe Rochford and his code breakers in Hawaii were pretty successful at breaking Japanese codes. And they figured out that the Japanese Navy is going to Midway. Magic was mostly diplomatic codes, but it's kind of the overview thing of our code operations. Purple was specifically the Navy codes that were broken. So that leads us into the Battle of Midway. Of course, Japan at this point in the war has immense numerical superiority. You can see it right here, 11 battleships, carriers, 8 carriers, cruisers, destroyers, they got it all. And they earmarked 4 of them to do the Midway operation. A lot of the other ships actually were going to go after some points in the Aleutian Islands. Many people in the mythology of it and stuff we've read in the past think that was a diversion. But believe it or not, the Japanese higher headquarters really wanted to grab the Aleutians. God love them, they could sit up there in the fog for the next 3 or 4 years, which is what they did when they needed those carriers for this main operation. Giant miscalculation to send the aircraft carriers to the Aleutians. A little bit of logistics on this. Midway is 2,647 nautical miles from Japan, and it's 1,500 miles from Hawaii. It's well outside their political objective area. So even if they win there, is this a good idea? Why not?
They can't defend it. I mean, basically it's so far away from their supply base that how are they going to maintain the power there to thwart aggression from states?
Anybody got any other thoughts? I 100% agree with Alan. Now, this is stupid. You're 2,600 miles away from home. You can come up with some scenarios. What if they go all the way over there, nobody fights them, they grab Midway? It's not anything you could stage future invasion forces to go after Hawaii or something. It's 1,500 miles anyway. It's beyond the range of their aircraft to do much of it, if anything, from Midway against Hawaii. And what about this? Well, you know, now the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet is Admiral Nimitz. He's a submarine guy. What if you take your submarine force, they've got 2,600-mile long, we call them SLOCs, surface lines of communication. Basically, they're transit lines. What if he just sends the submarines out there and it says, attack every cargo and logistics and oil ship that's coming by, and you cut off all the gas to them? You could draw up a scenario where their entire fleet was stuck at Midway out of gas. You know, there's a lot of ways you could have screwed with this. And Admiral Nimitz is going to be up to the task. At Midway, we've got a pretty small force, and it's really not very capable. It's early in the war. We've come out of the Depression. A lot of these aircraft we're using aren't very good. The aviators aren't very well trained. We could only send this carrier shown up here and the 3 immortal aircraft carriers that led the way. For us, is it important enough to fight over? Considering all we already discussed. What should America do now? We know they're coming there. We broke their codes. They're coming there with great force and they want to grab this island. What should we do? What's that?
We got out there and wait for them.
Go out there and wait for them? Is that the best idea?
Well, we sent Sproles to
I know what we did. I'm saying what we should do. What should we do?
Let them have it and come on and cut the oil.
That's an idea. Not to say what they did wasn't the right thing, what Nimitz does do, because Nimitz is brilliant about what he does do. He writes this message. He considers all the things we just said. He's like, I think he understood right from the very beginning, this is a major screw up by the enemy. They have given me, they've dealt me a royal straight flush here. I could profit from this. Yeah, ultimately I'll just send submarines out and sink all their transit ships if everything goes wrong. But what I'm gonna do is I am gonna engage them with the carriers I have. And he sends this message to his 2 commanders, Spruance and Fletcher. It's secret, probably top secret. Letter of instruction. If you can't read it, I'll read it for you. In carrying out the task assigned in the op plan, you will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, which you shall interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces, without good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage to the enemy. This applies to the landing phase as well as during preliminary air attacks. So what is he saying to his commanders there? Well, balls on your court, but what does he expect them to do?
Protect their own assets, but get maximum penalty on the Japanese.
Right. Hit them. Go out there and try and smack them around as much as you can. Attrite Japanese forces. See if you can sink a ship. Shoot down aircraft. But get out. If it starts getting bad, get out. This is a battle of choice. We're not defending California here. We don't, if worst case they take it, it's no big deal. It kind of works to our advantage anyway, one way or the other. So don't risk everything in this engagement. Just see if you can smack them, see if you can attrite some of their forces and make them pay for it. And he had 2, especially Admiral Spruance, really super capable guys out there to try and execute this. For me, I consider Nimitz one of the finest naval officers in the history of the United States Navy, and this just shows his mastery of his job. And his message reveals a complete, total understanding of the tactical and strategic situation. So a little bit about into the weeds of the battle. 4 June, the Japanese fleet arrives, at least the lead fleet with the aircraft carriers. 4 carriers launch the attack. On the island is you can see it, it's just little sandbars on some coral. There's a couple of landing fields, and there's some Marine Corps fighters out there, and there's some Army Air Force bombers. The Marine Corps fighters kind of harass the Japanese attack, kind of disrupt it a little bit, and the Army Air Corps bombers take off to get out of the way and go try to find the Japanese ships. The fighters, the Marine fighters in their crappy little Brewster Buffalo fighter planes really outman, but they do disrupt it enough that the field is not destroyed. So on the return leg of the flight by the Japanese flight leader, about 07 in the morning, 0700, he radios back this fateful message, second strike required. Meanwhile, PBY Catalina, 6 Catalina, finds one of the Japanese fleet. I mean, our communication systems and discussions and protocols are so bad, he basically says, main fleet, and doesn't tell them where it is, but we're really rookies at this. We're total rookies. Anyway, he finds the Japanese ships. He kind of sort of gives them a positional thing after a while. And Admiral Spruance orders an all-out max distance attack from Enterprise and Hornet. Admiral Fletcher's on the Yorktown, and he soon follows with the same order. Now, a little bit about the tactics at the fighting level for naval aviators back in the day. There was basically three kind of airplanes on a U.S. aircraft carrier. You had fighters. In those days, we had the F-4F Wildcat. We had the SBD Dauntless, which was a dive bomber, and the TBD Devastator, which was a torpedo plane. And the Dauntless and the Devastator were pretty crappy. Devastator wasn't that old, but it was really already obsolete. It was a piece of junk. The weapons that they used were terrible. And to combine, make it even worse, a lot of the aviators, a pretty significant percentage of the aviators had just arrived in the fleet, had like no more than 2 or 3, 4 hours flying these models. A whole bunch of them, almost half of them, I think, if I remember from years ago reading, had never even used the plane in training to drop a weapon. And these torpedo guys are going to go into combat with that in their back pocket. The Dauntlesses, the dive bombers were pretty good. The Wildcats are pretty good, but we've really never worked it all together. At the same time, our aircraft carrier operations are pretty rookie-like too. And on the morning of June 4th, when they say max launch, that's not something you do every day. And it's kind of hard to orchestrate it, and we didn't orchestrate it. It's chaos, and it all goes very, very slowly. The torpedo planes get off first, and are circling around up overhead, waiting for the other aircraft to join them. But the flight decks are clobbered, and it's a nightmare, absolute nightmare. But the intent was they all go in together. It's a coordinated attack. They're low, at wave top level to drop a torpedo. They're coming in from high, and so the enemy defenses are going to be split, and maybe it would give somebody a better chance of getting a hit in there. And unfortunately, especially for the torpedo planes, doesn't really work out. The torpedo planes start watching their fuel gauges start inching down, and they said, we got to push on. We got to push out because we're going to run out of gas, and we're not going to even get in on this. So they start pushing out to the west towards their last belief position for the Japanese carriers. Again, meanwhile, those land-based Army Air Force bombers attack the Japanese carriers. They get 0 hits because they're dropping bombs from high altitude. It's not hard to go, oh, look, there's a bomber and he dropped bombs. Okay, turn left. And you can see here's the track of the ship. And if they just were morons and it kept going that way, they get bombed. But pretty easy assignment for the conning officer there to get out of the way. About 0800, Japanese scout planes finally find American aircraft carriers. They find Yorktown. So they only know there's one. But now they got a real dilemma. Like, holy crap, these guys aren't supposed to be here. They're supposed to come in a week or so. What do I do? Admiral Nagumo is the commander on the scene, and he's got a lot of balls in the air now, figuring out what to do. First, he's got the first wave attack, which is half his air wings, half his planes, are coming back to the ships from the first hit on Midway. He's got to get them aboard because they're going to run out of gas. So he's got to recover them. And now they had been told, you need a second attack on the island. So they had uploaded bombs, land bombs, on the ships that were going to do the second attack. Now you got to change the bombs. Those aren't going to be effective against ships. You got to change them to armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes. And so they had to change the ordnance. And finally, in all the chaos, they're recovering planes, they're changing ordnance. They didn't have time to secure all this stuff. They just started dropping bombs off the planes and pushing them over on the carts to the side. They've got to refuel. They got to refuel the planes coming back for this big fight that's coming up. And so that's what's going on the Japanese ships. About that time, about 0920 actually, 3 waves of low and slow TBD Devastators attacked the Japanese carriers. They get there first. Had really great tactical leadership at the squadron level. They went right straight towards the carrier's position, and God love them. They were flying some very old design and very slow TBDs. Their torpedoes really sucked. Most of them didn't work, even if they had made a hit. Again, I always said aviators, almost no experience actually dropping the weapons. In order, VT-8, VT-6, and VT-3 flew in on essentially what was suicide missions and tried to get a hit with no luck. Every gun in the Japanese fleet was aimed at them and pounding away at them. Every Zero that was there in the air, the Zero Japanese fighters to defend the fleet had torn them up. And none of these guys got a hit. As a matter of fact, I think, might be it's old knowledge, but I think about only 3 guys survived all this stuff. 3 airplanes survived it and tried to get back to the carriers.
How many were there total?
Pardon me?
How many were in the original attack?
Let's see. Probably in my notes somewhere it was. Average squadron is probably about 15 or 16 aircraft, I think, back in those days. So I'm kind of guessing. But you're talking like, I remember there was a number, I think it's 39 or 38. 35 out of the 38 were destroyed.
Is that the one Ensign Gay survived?
Yeah. Yeah, he's one of the few survivors. Everybody know about Ensign Gay? Yeah, he got shot down and crashed into the sea in the midst of all the carriers and survives. They strafed him a little bit, but he kind of ducked down and hid under his life preserver and pops back up just about to watch history unfold, basically. Their sacrifice, I'm kind of going along. I wish I could talk more about the sacrifice of these guys. It's enormous, and it's so valiant. But you would almost think it was in vain. They had no help. But just by the grace of God or coincidence, if God takes a hand in things such as this, he did right now. Because almost just by the sheer luck, whatever you want to label it, those SPDs finally arrived. And they're flying in and they're like, where are the Zeros? They should be, we should be getting intercepted and shot at and all kinds of bad things happening to us. And they get there, and there's nothing. Nobody's shooting at them. There's no planes up there to intercept them. So while the final flight of the VT-3 torpedo guys were fighting and dying, high above, 3 squadrons of dauntless dive bombers had moved into position. And undetected, they would soon turn the battle decisively in favor of the Americans. Within minutes, Soryu, Kaga, and Akagi, or I should say it like Japanese, Soryu, Kaga, Akagi. They're all flaming torches. Remember, ordnance on deck, unsecured, fuel lines charged for refueling operations, and all kinds of planes full of gas. This is like, this is just a perfect setup. Regrettably, to the north, Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier not yet damaged. They watch what's going on, they go, holy crap. Their admiral says, all right, get ready, launch the planes and follow those American planes back to their ship. which is exactly what they do. And when they get there, find Yorktown, they launch their attack. They actually didn't, at that point, find Enterprise or Hornet yet. Yorktown, which had just had some emergency repairs following the Coral Sea hits that it took, they take 3 hits. From here, use dive bombers, 2 damage to continue to fight, abandon ship. But, turnabout's fair play, so Admiral Spruance is watching what's going on. He gets another attack ready and says, follow those Japanese carriers, airplanes back to their carrier, which they do. And as Yogi Berra said, it's not over till it's over. And as the admiral in charge on the Hiryu said, I'm having a very bad day. So 4th Japanese carrier is down. No carriers left for Yamamoto, who's in a task group to the west. He's got no carriers left to provide air cover for his landing forces. He cancels the operation, orders the entire fleet to retreat to the west. Probably can't blame him, but again, it shows some tentative. I mean, if you're going to do all this stuff, he had 4 aircraft carriers to the north up around the Aleutians. If you really wanted to do it, if it's that important, why don't you just sortie them down and in a day or so go after it again? But they retreat to the west and give up on the objective. Jap fleet smashed by U.S. See, this is June 7th, so it's fresh news. 2 carriers sunk. Actually, it was 4. But right in the middle of the newspaper, anybody look at that story right in the middle of the newspaper. Now, there's a lot of condemnation about American policy of interning Japanese citizens. And I'm not here to defend it. But I will say this. There were a lot, it was well known, there were a lot of Japanese nationalists in America amongst the immigrants that were here. And they were all rounded up, put in camps, and were cut off from stuff like this. This is the Chicago Tribune. Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea. Somebody leaked the knowledge that we had broken their codes. And it's on the freaking front page of the Chicago Tribune. And the Japanese never found out. So, like it or not, the value of those codes is immeasurable. And with no espionage threat whatsoever in America, we got away with it. We got away with one of the worst operational security violations I have ever heard of. Who has the advantage now in the Pacific? Just give you a strategic picture before we talk about that. Japan still has 9 carriers left. Most of all their naval aviators at Midway are saved. So they still got the personnel. And even though they lost the planes, there's plenty of planes. Japan back in the home islands has plenty of planes. So they can throw them in new airplanes and set them out to do missions as soon as they get reorganized. So who's got the advantage now, and what should the Japanese do now? But first of all, who has the advantage in the war in the Pacific?
Depends on whether you're considering how many ships we're producing.
How many ships we're producing, but are they there yet?
No, not yet.
Japanese still have a huge preponderance of force in the Pacific. Huge advantage still. But what should they do? If they haven't learned it yet, what should they do?
Attack.
Huh?
Attack.
Attack who?
Try to destroy what's left of the Navy.
How's that worked out for them so far?
Poorly.
So you're gonna follow a bad strategy to another step and protect the homeland is a comment. I'd say, your original plan and your force is designed to execute this plan is to defend this East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Every time you've ever gone outside of it on an operation, you go to Hawaii, that turns into a big screw up, really. If you really wish we could analyze that a little bit more of time. You go outside to Coral Sea, you get smacked. You go outside the Midway and you get hammered. And so, this is not working out. And that goes back to Clausewitz's point of policy, strategy, match. Your strategy better match the damn policy. Because every time, I could cite you a million other historical examples, but right here, we have 3 times where the strategy didn't match the policy, and it backfires on them. Because they're quickly losing the ability to defend themselves now from the attrition of these battles of choice.
Wasn't that soon after when they started to get their kamikazes and start going after the American fleet again?
So what was the beginning of the question about kamikazes?
No, wasn't that when Japan started?
No, they didn't start kamikaze attacks till we started to invade the Philippines. Well, whatever way you might think they should do, what they do is they move into the South Pacific, into the Solomon Islands, which is on nobody's radar scope. It's in the middle of nowhere, beyond, again, their policy objective area, and they discover, they start to build an airstrip on Guadalcanal. Anybody know what they were thinking? What's the plan? Why are they building an airstrip on Guadalcanal?
Perhaps to think about invading Australia?
Yeah, they're thinking about, first of all, cutting the surface lines, the transit lines between America and Australia. And yeah, maybe somewhere downstream, they're thinking about invading Australia. But is that, I mean, come on, is that feasible? At this stage in the war? This is just their cultural ineptitude, like, bonsai, their samurai code and everything, like, we're not gonna back down. This is not rational decision making anymore. They should be hunkering down, getting, figuring out ways to make up for the loss of the 4 carriers and getting into a war where they can really attrite American forces that they know are coming. But the question is, should America contest Guadalcanal? It's really, is it a threat? Does anybody know the geography out there? It's not really a threat to Australia. It's not really a threat to the lines of communication to Australia. It's, I had the numbers I thought, but let me just say it's a long way from Guadalcanal's airfield that they're building down to areas where you could actually even reach where the transit lines are. And if you did it, if you get all the way down there, I mean, how hard would it be to stop that? In friendly air territories, there's any number of places that the Americans and the Australians could have built airfields, interdict the attacking aviation forces that would have been at max range. And so, it's not really a threat to anything. It was kind of a stepping stone for them. Maybe they can work further south into those South Pacific islands and do it, but again, this is nonsense. They should be playing defense. They should have Bill Belichick coaching them up and saying, let's figure out how to kill as many Americans as we can when they come after us. But very controversial is Admiral King. He's the Chief of Naval Operations. He goes directly to the White House. There's no Joint Chiefs of Staff like we have today. As a matter of fact, his actions now are probably one of the main arguments of why they developed the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1947. Because he goes directly to President Roosevelt and goes, the Japanese are building an aircraft, a base on this Guadalcanal, and we need to stop it. And he convinces a civilian who has none of these, tactical, operational thoughts in his head. He convinces Roosevelt to do it. And I'm sure the Army Chief of Staff and all these other guys were pissed off when the word comes down like, hey, we're gonna go oppose this field building here, and we weren't even really ready. First of all, what are American priorities in the middle of 1942 when they're making these decisions in July? What's number one priority in the war? Well, but nobody's going to invade America anytime soon. But what'd you say?
Germany.
Germany's the priority. What if we lose? What if the Soviet Union is defeated? Does anybody realistically think that the United States could defeat Germany without the Soviet allies? Remember, when we invaded Normandy, I forget the exact number of German divisions in Western France. I think it's like 6 or 7. The Russians were fighting 85 to 90 divisions most of the war. Can you imagine if they just took 40 of those divisions and put them on the Atlantic Wall? Good luck with that. Good luck with that. You ain't getting in there. So number one priority is keep our allies fighting, Germany first. But now all of a sudden, we're going to go do this operation in the Southwest Pacific nobody's even heard of. And we don't have the force to do it. The force they choose is the 1st Marine Division. Remember, it's July 1942, so if you do a quick timeline in your head, what's their status? What's their level of training? Well, the average Marine in the 1st Marine Division had probably enlisted at the beginning of 42, went to boot camp for a few months, went to a service school to learn how to operate his radio or his mortar or something, and probably around May, June, he was assigned to the 1st Marine Division. They have never even had divisional level training together. They don't know how to fight together as a division. Never done it before, and all the officers are new to each other. This is a nightmare. And where were they? They're in the middle of the Pacific on ships going to New Zealand with all their gear. And in New Zealand, they were supposed to take the next several months and work themselves up as a division to get ready to fight. But here comes the word from the president on high, no, go to Guadalcanal. The commanding general, Vandegrift, is like, what? What are you talking about? I'm not even combat loaded with my freight. You know, if you're doing a transit with your gear to New Zealand for training, you load the ships in a certain way for seakeeping for a 4,000 mile sea journey. If you're going to go invade an island, you're going to load your gear a little bit differently. And so they were nowhere near ready for this. They don't even have charts on the island or maps. There's no intelligence on enemy strength. So should we have done that? What do you think would happen to strategic leaders today if they took a absolutely we used to do readiness when I was an operations guy at the squadron level and ship level. You had to put in your readiness conditions all monthly, and these guys, there was categories. Like if you just came off a deployment and a bunch of guys transfer out and you transfer out some airplanes, you would be in a readiness condition was not combat, not operational ready. Well, that's really where the Marine Division was. But nevertheless, Admiral King, he was an interesting character. As it said, he was one of the most abrasive, nasty guys anybody ever met. He was about ready to retire when the war broke out, and Roosevelt calls him up and says, hey, can you extend an active duty to be Chief of Naval Operations? And that famous saying he came up with, see, he says this to some junior guy, he says, see, when they get in trouble, they send for the sons of bitches.
Paul, what's the time frame there now? Are we talking April 42?
We're now talking probably late July when they find out about the field, and King gets this plan in motion in July, because they're going to go in August. But we still are in the Marines are undersupplied. I mean, this is a nightmare. Was the president's involvement appropriate? I probably made it pretty clear, pretty obvious what I think. But you think the president's involvement was appropriate in this tactical decision?
No.
Absolutely not. And what does it do when the president gets behind an operation like that? What does that do to the priorities for Europe first and all that other stuff? And what are the Russians who are hanging on by fingernails, and they keep yelling second front, second front? Remember, the Russians always believed the Allies, the British and the Americans, they want us to fight the Germans to the last Russian, and then they can come in and take over. They're very cynical about us, and this only feeds into that. They're like, oh man, what are you doing over here? Because we're going to have to reroute a lot of stuff to support Guadalcanal. Well, anyway, for chapter 1 of this, the 1st Marine Division lands on Guadalcanal. 16,000 Marines come storming ashore, pretty much unopposed. They've got elements of the Navy which are there to kind of bring in supplies, and they immediately capture the airfield. But within a day, Japanese are aroused to this. There wasn't a big contingent of Japanese forces on the island, mostly construction kind of guys. But within a day, Japanese decide, nah, we're not going to let that stand. So they come with a task force down through the Solomons, an area that gets nicknamed the slot between some islands. And they engage the defending U.S. Navy force at the Battle of Savo Island. Worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. You can see the ships we lost there, 1,000 sailors killed. His old Vice Admiral Mikawa, pretty good. Japanese superior night fighting capabilities really slaughtered our ships. Not really a good match. As a result of that naval defeat, the Allied forces, naval forces, had to withdraw. The only cargo they got ashore was the stuff they could. It wasn't priority loaded on the ships very well. So the Marines got what they got, pretty much what they brought in on their backs and not much more. So they're in an extremist situation right off the bat. Japanese have naval dominance, so they start reinforcing with land forces the guys they have on there, and they're going to go after the Marines to try and kick them off the island. The lifeline for the Marines is this field they captured. They fixed it up and got it operational. They named it Henderson Field, and that's the only way for the Americans to get anything in or out. You're not going to be able to get large numbers of guys flown in there. We didn't have that kind of transport capability, nor large numbers of supplies, just absolute essential stuff. It becomes the object of nightly naval bombardments by the Japanese and concerted Japanese land attacks. The air superiority that this field provided during day is what kept them going, because the Japanese ships that come down at night, we weren't capable of night operations, aviation night operations in those days, so they'd come down and bomb it at night, and in the daytime they'd try and get the field up and operational, so the Japanese would have to withdraw their ships. To make matters worse, early September, the Japanese sub sank USS Wasp, damaged the USS Saratoga, 2 aircraft carriers, torpedo US North Carolina, further isolates the Americans the Marines on Guadalcanal. This Tokyo Express, it's the nickname for their shuttling in a steady stream of Japanese transports to attack the island, attack the Marines on the island. Late August, early September, they built up forces on Japan they thought was competent enough, large enough to get rid of the Marines, but it all went in kind of piecemeal. That's a flaw in their operation here at Guadalcanal. Everything was kind of piecemeal. They've got more people that they can get in, and they're more able to support it, but they kind of piecemeal. They don't send in this decisive force right from the get-go, and that's really going to hamper their operations. Also, they have really poor intelligence. They always underestimated the Marines' strength. And in one example, it leads to a battle at the Tenaroo River. Anybody ever see that miniseries, The Pacific? No? Oh, you got to see that. Yeah, the Pacific, Alligator Creek is what the Marines called it. But the Marines killed 789 of the 917 attacking Japanese from this Ichiki regiment. I mean, it was just, you know, the guys were joking about it the next morning like a turkey shoot. But again, I recommend to you the HBO miniseries Pacific. Shortly after, though, second wave attacks, September 12th and 14th. Japanese put a force on there, 6,200 Japanese soldiers, and they're going to be involved in assaulting a ridge south of Henderson Field, defended by 840 Marines. It was the 840 Marines were commanded by a guy named Colonel Red Edson, and this area here gets known as Edson's Ridge because he's going to defend it, as Marines will do. The Japanese were hampered in their night movements to line up for this attack. They're hampered by the dense jungle. And this, again, it's piecemeal. Their attack is going to become piecemeal. They couldn't coordinate their attacks because everybody's arriving in position late or at different times. So the first night of the battle goes pretty poorly for the Japanese, but they still got a huge force out there. Second night of the battle is General Kawaguchi, the Japanese commander, assembles over 3,000 soldiers, for a frontal assault on the ridge. Here's a quote from a Marine participant, Captain William McKinnon. "The Japanese attack was almost constant, like a rain that subsides for a moment and then pours the harder. When one wave was mowed down, and I mean mowed down, another followed it into death. After a couple of nights of battle, though, the Kawaguchi Brigade was shattered, lost 3/4 of its officers and men, and the assault on the ridge had effectively ended." Pretty gruesome picture. I know it's black and white and stuff, but you can see a pretty gruesome picture. All the lumps are Japanese soldiers. You can see up here in the haze, the Marines coming down to survey the battlefield, and almost ghost-like. Can't imagine, 2 nights, no sleep at all, no rest, constant fighting, and the ridge was defended. This battle over one ridge between total, 34, maybe 3,800 soldiers of both sides combined, has enormous strategic effects though. 15 September, Imperial General Headquarters in Japan learns of the defeat. In an emergency session, the Japanese Army and Navy command staffs conclude that Guadalcanal might develop into the decisive battle of the war. What they're thinking is behind that brainstorm is beyond me, but basically they just lost a fight on a ridge. But Guadalcanal has no strategic significance, and I don't know. I'm kind of left speechless because I really don't understand it. But that decision is going to lead to significant revision of their operational plans. They were making a major operation over in New Guinea, just to the west, and that was a very, very dangerous operation to Allied efforts, and they basically pulled the plug on that and put it on hold, and that was a big deal. But following Edson's Ridge, there is still going to be massive buildup. They still have naval dominance there. They're still going to feed troopers in there, but again, never a decisive-sized force. And General Vandegrift states afterwards that after Edson's Ridge, he never felt like there was any question of the outcome of this battle. Even though he was not getting reinforcements, his supplies were really trickling in, he never felt that threatened. Even though large forces still came on the island after that, it was the high water mark for the Japanese was the attack on Edson's Ridge. We're getting into November now. It's been a really freaking nasty fight on the island. The Japanese finally decide, let's put a decisive force in there. They've attrited a lot of the Marines. Remember, the Marines, they're basically dealing with malaria, malnutrition and stuff. Everybody on the island was sick. You fought, you were on the line unless your temperature was above, only way off the line was if your temperature was above 103 degrees. These are some pretty sick guys, just barely hanging on. And now they're going to put a decisive fresh force in there, 11,000 Japanese troops. They're bringing it down with battleships, cruisers, destroyers. They get into a battle on the night of 12th through the 13th of November. The desperate naval battle for Guadalcanal, 12-13 November. I mean, this is like a melee. All the ships at night were just intermingled. There's a story of an American destroyer that was so close in under a Japanese battleship that they couldn't even see it, and it just blasted away from like point-blank range. The stories are amazing. But Japanese have superior optic sights, well-practiced night battle drill, and it's deadly effective. An officer on one of the American ships likened it to a barroom brawl after the lights had been shot out. Japanese gain victory, but they suspend landing the 11,000 troops. They're going to come back and do it the next night. Subsequently, an air attack on those transport ships sank several of the Japanese transports. So the delay caused by the sacrifice of the American fleet there allows the Marines on Guadalcanal to strike the transports and eliminate a lot of that 11,000 man force. Second battle for Guadalcanal, 14-15 November. The Japanese task force was now met by a newly commissioned we're starting to see some of the stuff, the new stuff. The force buildup is first felt really in the Pacific because they're going to be met by some newly commissioned ships. And the advantage in technology that gave us is enormous. USS Washington almost single-handedly strikes the decisive blow against the Japanese in this. There's a new thing out now in the fleet, and we've actually learned how to use it, surface radars. Japanese didn't have surface radars. They had great optical stuff for night fighting and so forth, but surface radars are a new thing, and the guys on the Washington really knew how to use it. So you could coordinate your radar returns with your naval fires and hit targets from great distances. And Washington goes in there and basically kicks butt all night on this Japanese force. The coordination of the American force coming in there is terrible, but Washington puts a beat down on the Japanese force. Additional air attacks in the morning destroyed more of the transports, and ultimately out of that 11,000 man force the Japanese were trying to put in there, they lose 9,000 guys. That's irreplaceable guys to the Japanese because they're stretched pretty thin. You always have to keep in the back of your mind, there's 1 million Japanese soldiers fighting in China. So anybody beyond that is pretty high priority. The Imperial Japanese Navy now only able to deliver some subsistence supplies, few replacement troops, but the Japanese soldier is going to continue their vicious battle. They fight to the death before they would surrender. But by February, it's just like, see if we can rescue some of these guys. Excuse me, and they do get 12,000 troopers out of there, evacuate the island. Marine Corps veterans on Guadalcanal, there's a famous old saying about them. For those who fought there, Guadalcanal is not a name, it is an emotion. And a rhyme they came up with, and when he gets to heaven, to St. Peter he will tell, another Marine reporting, sir, I've served my time in hell. It's hard to overstate the suffering and sacrifice by the Americans who served around Guadalcanal. Bastogne in the European theater was considered an epic struggle. The 101st Airborne was surrounded there for 8 days. The 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal was basically isolated for 4 months. There's been few such stands in history. They were all but abandoned by the vessels that brought them there. They were reduced to eating roots and weeds. They were kept on the line through those stricken by malaria unless their temperature exceeded 103 degrees. They fought the best soldiers Japan could send against them, killed over 20,000 of them, and achieved a completely improbable victory. Winston Churchill, after studying the battle, simply wrote, "Long may the tale be told in the great republic." Now, there's no point talking about battles. I mean, there's 1 million battles. Some of them are just footnotes. Some of them have real strategic results. So the premise of the talk today was the turning point. What's the turning point? The strategic results of the battles. Midway. Midway was a devastating loss of capital ships for Japan. But, in caps, most of their naval aviators were rescued. And plenty of their aircraft in their inventory was in their inventory to get them flying again. But I'm not trying to diminish the loss of 4 capital ships. That was an enormous blow. But they still had 9 aircraft carriers operational. And really all that we gained from our victory was a reprieve. We kind of delayed Japanese operations and gave us more time to develop this modern fleet that's ultimately going to overwhelm them. The Guadalcanal campaign resulted in devastating losses to the Japanese in aircraft, aviators, and troops. They were trying to strike Guadalcanal during the day with aviation from Rabaul, which is about max distance flying for the Japanese aviators. So by the time they got into the area of operations around Guadalcanal, they were already running out of gas. They really couldn't engage and do what they needed to do. It wasn't a fair fight when they got down there. So they lose tons of aviators around the Guadalcanal campaign. And that was the biggest thing that they couldn't replace. The Japanese, another criticism of their culture, it wasn't cool to be an instructor pilot. You know, you got to be a samurai. You got to be out there flying the missions for the war. So they never had a process where an experienced aviator would go back to their training command and train up new guys and rotate, and so you'd rotate out skilled aviators. They pretty much, they never did that. So when they lose all these aviators in the Guadalcanal campaign, there's really not any really talented, high-level, good, skilled pilots to replace them. They compromised their important, far more strategically important campaign in New Guinea, and Douglas MacArthur ends up being successful there, primarily based on, probably you could argue primarily based on the fact that they took force away from that to defend New Guinea for this idiotic Guadalcanal campaign. And soon, just to the west of there is the Dutch East Indies. Anybody know what that, I mentioned it earlier, but anybody know what's the significance, logistic significance? Dutch East Indies, that's where Shell gasoline, Royal Dutch Shell gasoline came from the Dutch East Indies. That's Japan's lifeline for fuel. And they conquered it early in the war, and they gotta have it. You can't fight a naval war with the types of ships that they had back in those days without a lot of oil. I think strategic results are pretty much summed up pretty well by Admiral Halsey when he said, before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours. So I had some additional slides, but kind of getting long on time. So pretty much just talking about episodes and trends. But why don't I just go to some final thoughts? Maybe we'll get to that some other time. Talk about war production, though. Just to give you, an idea of how magnificent this was. This is just one assembly line, one day. Liberty ships, they were cranking out a Liberty ship every 3 days. They got the time to make them down to 70 days. But let's have some final thoughts. What factors do you think, after the discussion and what you've read about in the past stuff, what do you think accounts for why America won the war in the Pacific? There's probably no right answer, but I was just wondering what people think.
Capability of production.
Capability of production, somebody said.
Yeah.
We just saw pictures of this awesome industrial capacity generating all this stuff out there.
We had lines of supply they didn't have.
Yeah, lines of supply. What? Yeah. Anything else? When did the turning point take place? Probably Guadalcanal, right? Did we have all that logistic stuff?
Not yet.
Not yet. But they turned the tide of battle and started to win without it.
And the mindset of the Japanese leadership, political, imperial, and military.
Yeah. Yeah, that's selection A. I mean, everything is part of the reason why we won. I think the Japanese strategic ineptitude is a big piece of it. I think our ability to produce mass quantities is an enormous piece of it. Our intelligence advantage was overwhelming. They had no intelligence. They never knew what was going on with us. We knew pretty much what was always going on with them. But I would argue that it came down to superior tactical leadership and the indomitable tenacity of the American fighting man. So I get to say that a day after Veterans Day, and I truly believe it. You can give them all the gear, and there's there are nations that have in the past always had material advantages, but weren't able to do it. And despite the fact of our advantages, they had certain tactical advantages too that we discussed. They had a big Navy. They had geographic position that were great for defense. You know, there were a lot of things that they could have done, no matter how much stuff you built, they could have just kept sinking it if it wasn't for this. So, anybody have any questions?
Well, I have one quick one. I'm still not clear why the Japanese invaded Midway in the first place. You might have said it, I missed it. But
Yeah, the biggest reason was they viewed the aircraft carrier, American aircraft carrier threat as the most severe threat to the home islands. And Yamamoto's plan is, if I grab this island, they're going to come out with their aircraft carrier fleet and try and attack me and drive me away. That will expose them, because he was so cocky, he was sure that if I can just get them out, because, you know, we had been using them for like these hit and run type of missions under Admiral Halsey. And Yamamoto's convinced, if I can just get these guys out in the open ocean where I know where they are, we can kill them. We'll kill them all. So it was simply for that reason. And again, it just defies logic because there's so many alternatives to tactics that the Americans could have employed that would have just neutralized that. But they get kind of blinders on, you know. And that was one of the biggest parts of their cultural ineptitude. When they war game stuff, they never really, you know what I'm saying? When I say we war game stuff, we would put counter forces when we were training up for stuff. And one guy would be the attacking force, and the other team will be the defending force, and they'll kind of do the things that they would do to fight it out, to see who wins. When we do that, we do it honestly. Like, we'll, we won't favor somebody because he's a senior officer and of great renown. The Japanese were terrible. You know, if they put together a war game to test out a theory, it was always the senior admiral whose idea it was. They'd always kind of fix the game so he won. They just kind of did it to themselves.
What do you think would have happened, any delays possible if the Japanese had bombed the oil reserves at Pearl Harbor and the ship repair docks?
Yeah, that's another point of their tentativeness in attack. You know, what he said was, what do you think why they didn't bomb the dry docks and the oil reserves at Pearl Harbor when they had the chance? And I think that was another one of these kind of like tentative attacks. They were like extended 2,600 or however far it is. It's further than that. I forget the distance from Pearl Harbor to Hawaii, but it's like 4,000 miles. So they got it sticking way out there, and you know, it's a complete surprise, and they've got this enormous tactical advantage, and they only launched 2 attacks. They sink a bunch of old, antiquated battleships that really would have never had a serious impact on this war anyway. And they ignore real strategic targets like dry docks and the oil reserves there. There was enough oil across Pearl Harbor on the other side that they were probably burning that oil at Midway. And so, yeah.
Those battleships, had they done the docks, they'd have left them there. They're not going to tow them back to Long Beach to repair them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the dry docks become critical when Yorktown was reported sunk by the Japanese after the Battle of Coral Sea, and they limped back into Pearl Harbor, right into a fresh new dry dock, and get emergency repairs done. It would not have been possible if they'd blown that stuff up. So you would have had one less carrier at Midway. So, anybody else?
I don't think, I'm going back to Hanson's book, we hear all the horror story of the 2 atom bombs that were dropped. What was, the firebombing of Tokyo is well reported, but apparently according to that book, 60 of the 66 largest municipalities in Japan had been at least 50% firebombed away. And whoever the general, Curtis McKay,
LeMay, Curtis LeMay.
Said, and he was responsible for that firebomb. He said, the 2 atom bombs were superfluous. They were on their way out from America.
Yeah. The war was won. It's very controversial. I always come down on the side of dropping atomic bombs, but maybe a subject for an additional lecture at some other time. Because I'd just like to say, if you enjoyed this, and we're going to have these men's group get-togethers, that's just a tip of the iceberg, and it's kind of a sample of what we did at the War College. But
We can do all kinds of things.
yeah, I taught an undergraduate course up in New Jersey at a small college up there in the American Civil War. It's like a 200 level. And I turned that in kind of a strategic analysis. So if you like this, you got some areas of interest, why don't you let me know somehow through the wickets, and we can put together some similar discussions. He just brought up end of war termination strategies. How do we do on that stuff? We could spend an hour talking about that. So thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.